So every month we have a monthly theme, and this month's theme is covenant. Covenant at its most basic form is a promise. And we know that when we make promises, we will break promises. That's part of the process of making a promise. But all month long, we're going to explore some of the different covenants that we're in, some of the different promises that we have made. And the one I want to begin with, fittingly, because it is Labor Day weekend, is the labor contract, the labor agreement. What precisely we mean about labor and why we have it in the first place. So, of course, you can't begin any Labor Day sermon without talking about the origins of Labor Day. And as we know, this might be a history refresher for some and a history lesson for others. We'll find out together. Labor Day emerges from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brings in a great transformation in political and religious and economic thought. So we're moving from feudal monarchies to constitutional monarchies and democracies. We see the rise of Marxism and what emerges from its socialism, which is just a little bit different enough that we can talk about those differences. We see the emergence of Protestantism as all part of this, and the literacy that comes along with Protestantism. They believed in the word alone and only the word. So we see literacy rates rise around Europe and the colonial projects of Europe, because being able to read the Bible for your own self allows you to interpret in a way that the Catholic Church was keeping down for some folks. We also see the rise of capitalism as it replaces what we have known in terms of feudal monarchies. And that, of course, gives us the rise of the Protestant work ethic itself, as reflected in Aesop's fables and the like. Labor Day also comes to us because we know that workers were being exploited. We had factories that were running 7 days a week. As a matter of fact, the English language origins of Sunday school are about the fact that child workers sometimes only got Sunday mornings off. So middle class and noble English women started making reading programs for children, and that became what we know as Sunday school now. But we know that the workers were working around the clock, and if they got injured, there was nothing for them. If they couldn't make it to work, they would get fired. There was a glut of labor as people are leaving the countryside and entering into the cities. And towards the middle and end of the 19th century, the 1800s, finally the workers say, enough. Enough. We have been serfs. We have been dispossessed peasants. We are workers now, and we have rights. We want rights. How exactly we go about getting those rights are different depending if we're looking at the European story versus the North American story. But the way in our nation it happened is after lots and lots of violent protests, lots of fighting for 8-hour workdays, for such a thing as workers' compensation. If you get injured on the job, maybe you shouldn't just be without a job and without any other way to take care of yourself. Maybe perhaps there should even be some safety regulations. Maybe we shouldn't just have gears all out in the open where they can catch on people's clothes. Perhaps we can enclose some of those units. After years and years and years of these protests, and most immediately because of the Pullman railcar strike, where the army was called in to bust up a strike, including railroad engineers, finally, President Grover Cleveland, having put down the strike, rushes back to Congress and says, you need to pass a bill making Labor Day a holiday. This is 1894. There was not a single vote against the passage of Labor Day. Interestingly enough, Labor Day was originally a Sunday holiday, largely in part because so many of the workers lived out in the countries, in the countryside, and they wanted to be able to drink in a park on Sunday afternoon. So if there was a holiday, they could drink publicly, but if there was no holiday, they couldn't. In 1968, the Uniform Holiday Act that Congress passed aligned Labor Day with Monday, but until then, Labor Day was observed at different times, mostly on Sundays in other parts of the nation. This history is important because we didn't always have the worker protections that we have, but it obscures one important fact, and that's that there is no inherent value to labor. What I mean by that, value in society itself is contextual. All right. So what I do has value to you, I hope, but might not have value to a different religious community. It might not have value in a different time and place from now. Whether someone is good at tennis or not only matters if maybe they're playing professionally. Someone who is good at tennis but instead is a social worker, the fact that they're good at tennis doesn't allow us to say that they're also very good at the job of social work. How we also know that there's no inherent value to labor is that transactional value can cheapen even the most intimate of experiences. Imagine if we boiled every wedding down to how much you spent on the cake, or how successful a congregational community is by how much they have in the bank at any given time. That is not what we actually value. When we only view value in terms of financial terms, we lose important things about how we want to be together and how we can be together going forward. And finally, on a very technical note, we know that prices rise more quickly than wages do. And if a price has anything to do with how much energy and effort you put into something, the fact that we actually have to pay people more to do a thing should also factor into the price. But it doesn't. So we know that there is no inherent value to labor. It is contextual, and sometimes it's even just a feature of decisions that we have made together. Another important part of understanding Labor Day in a religious context is the nature of the Protestant work ethic itself. Again, we understand from the time that Martin Luther starts to post those theses on the door of the Catholic Church. Interestingly enough, I always like to point this out. You know that Martin Luther wasn't a Lutheran. He was an excommunicated Catholic. And that should inform some of the ways we do things sometimes. Sometimes when we're setting a new pathway, we're creating the path for something new before we've all the way exited what we were already doing. So in his view of Catholicism, what was most important was doing good things to bring about more good things in the world. This might sound like other religious traditions. There's only so much original religious thought that you can handle at any one given time. It's okay. If we work hard, we'll be rewarded. If we don't work hard, we'll be punished. That is the core of the Protestant work ethic. But we know that evil in society exists for reasons that we can't even explain it. So boiling down all of why your life isn't going well to you're being punished for not trying hard enough seems callous at best, and is certainly unfaithful in a Unitarian Universalist context at worst. As Unitarian Universalists, we're also responsible for this history because we were those Protestants, we were those New England Brahmins doing some of this work of saying we have to go out and do all the good we can do. And until the 1960s, Unitarians even believed in the perfectibility of all, not human, all mankind. Of all mankind. We didn't change that language until the 1980s. So we need to be accountable to this history because we know it not to be true, and we also know that it does a lot of damage. So for example, Reverend Gordon last Sunday spoke to us about benefiting and eating from the fruit of other trees. We know that people have planted things for us, financial, sometimes spiritual, sometimes intellectual, that we get to benefit from. And when we don't make sense of our place in countering the narrative of the Protestant work ethic, it can also, again, obscure some really important realities, like those of wealth and generational wealth, that people who have generational wealth have sometimes profited from the theft of peoples and lands. have profited from uncompensated labor or sometimes undercompensated labor, or even from things like here on our beloved chain of islands, opportunistic marriage, so that we would marry into families and then steal the land that was the generational wealth of Native peoples. I say all of this, and perhaps I shouldn't have buried the lead. I think you already know that having more money doesn't make you a good person, right? So certainly, if having more doesn't make you a good person, then having less certainly can't make you a bad one. When we fail to counter the narratives of the Protestant work ethic, we also interpret how we read classical literature. So again, returning to Aesop, we don't actually know that this person existed. All of the research I did over the past couple days, there are various origin stories that we think are largely made up. Apocryphally, we believe him to be a Greek slave. Comparison with the tales of Uncle Remus, who again was not one person, but a set of stories that were collected and then attributed to a person. And the fact that Aesop was believed to be very unattractive, merged to have a belief that Aesop was actually of African origin. But we don't know this guy. We do know he probably didn't write all of these stories, and that they get reinterpreted and retold in different ways over the course of time. So every time when we hear a story, when we hear a fable, when we hear something that comes to us from a different time and different place, we have to do the work of saying who benefits from the narrative. When we have a narrative that tells us that there is no time for play and there is only time for work, the consequences are punishment. I need us to be more curious, because a story that says that rest isn't allowed, that joy isn't allowed, that says that, hey, you need to do what you need to do, is not a narrative that helps us all get free. It's not a narrative that keeps our values that are not financial values, but our values that are spiritual and interpersonal values at the center. It's a narrative that allows us to ignore opulence and people who do no work but always have money, while the rest of us struggle trying to share what's left. Because there is no inherent value to labor, what we have to do then is plot a course for the future where the history we're making right now continues the journey for collective liberation from value as an exchange for goods and services. I read again, because there is no inherent value to labor, we must plot a course for the future where the history we're making now continues the journey for collective liberation from value as an exchange of goods and services. How do we do that? I've already mentioned owning our spot in the narrative of the Protestant work ethic. It's easy for us to challenge it. All we have to do is own it and remember that more doesn't make us better, less doesn't make us better, less doesn't make us bad, more doesn't make us bad. We are bound up. We are bound up together for the work of collective liberation. We are bound up together in a labor contract, knowing that the work of the church has to be done, knowing that the fields have to be plowed and harvested, but the corn grows itself. The taro grows itself. The poi takes energy and effort. So how do we make sure that we're always centering where the labor is and how we value it in a way that builds community rather than separation? We can also identify our position on the pathway to collective liberation and decide what to do next. Some of the time, I think the hardest part of building the beloved community is remembering that we're already on the path. Where are we right now? Where were the ancestors before us? And how are we part of one continuous tale that will allow us to be part of a history that hopefully future generations will be proud of someday? When we identify where we are on our pathway, we know how much further we have to go. The goal is the same as it always has been, to get free and to get free together. And to remember that Labor Day is a day for action and for rest. We know that onslaughts against labor will come and come and come as they always have come. There will always be more hard work for the classes that do the most work to do. And we need to make sure that people are fairly compensated and cared for in the process. But on Labor Day, we rest. We rest because the ancestors fought for us to rest. We rest because in a world that tells us we must always do more and more and more, rest is a resistance strategy. And we rest because, as I've said it before, the work will still be there to be done on the other side of the rest. Don't worry if you take a little bit of time now. Maybe somebody else is doing the work. And if they're not, the work will still be there to do tomorrow. So Labor Day for Unitarian Universalists requires us to question who we were, to plot where we are, and to work for a future that's even better than the one that we can imagine right now. As we know, and we continue to know in this time and in all times, the pathway between here and collective liberation from monetary value is pitted with obstacles. And how long that pathway is unknowable. It is generationally and multi-generationally long. But when we imagine ourselves as part of a future where that world exists, where we know labor because it brings us joy and not because it's what we need in order to put food on the table. When we imagine ourselves as part of that world, we can take the action that we need today to get ourselves as close as we can to that goal as possible. And in that process, we continue the work of those who fought for what we have today, which is an unfinished and not fully realized dream. Beloveds, it's time for us to make future history. A future history that plots us on the pathway of getting free together. A history that will make future generations proud. On this journey we go, on this journey so shall we continue. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.